Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I guess I'll stand up and wander around while I'm talking. This project really sort of originated in thinking about nuclear security and recognizing that the real cases of theft of highly enriched uranium or plutonium were almost all perpetrated either by insiders or with the help of insiders. And there are also more cases than people realize of sabotage of nuclear facilities. Never cases of sabotage intended to cause a major radioactive release, but nonetheless significant cases of sabotage. Most recently in 2014, an insider at the Doel 4 nuclear power plant in Belgium opened a valve, drained out all the lubricant for the turbine overheated and destroyed itself. If you count the cost of the turbine and the cost of the replacement electricity, it's about $200 million in economic damage. So these, insiders in the nuclear space do happen, but they happen so rarely, and so often it's even rarer that we know exactly how it happened enough to learn lessons, that Scott Sagan from Stanford and I decided, let's broaden out. Let's look at insider threats across a variety of different contexts, and maybe we can find some common organizational lessons that will help organizations deal with insider threats. So I want to thank Scott and a terrific set of authors. If I can get this to do its thing. Okay.
Magic Jill here.
I think she's on lunch break.
We had it all set up. It was working a moment ago.
Just click next.
There we go. All right. So we have a great set of authors. This is part of the Global Nuclear Future project at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We have a great chapter by Thomas Hegghammer and Andreas Daly. Hegghammer is one of the great scholars of jihadi movements. He's in Norway. And they do a really interesting deep dive, not only on what jihadis have actually done with respect to nuclear things, but what they've talked about, even on the postings on the dark web and things like that. Amy Ziegart has a really in-depth case study on Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter. Jessica Stern and Ron Schuten have a similarly in-depth study on the truly strange case of Bruce Ivins. Austin Long has an interesting chapter on Afghan troops killing their American helpers and trainers, and why did that skyrocket in roughly 2014 and then go right back down again. A student of mine, Kate Glenn, and I did a chapter looking at casinos in the pharmaceutical industry, in particular the people who make things like OxyContin that people would really want to steal, with the thought that, gee, they have a profit incentive to get insider protection right. Maybe we can learn from them. Turns out the environment, especially in the casino industry, is just so dramatically different that the degree of ability to learn lessons is, I think, relatively modest, but we make an attempt. And then Scott and I have a sort of elaboration of what some of you may have seen in a pamphlet earlier, what we call a worst practices guide, sort of mistakes that led to past disasters, which is what I'll talk about today. So it's clear that there are a bunch of both cognitive biases and organizational biases that make it difficult for us to really cope with the insider threat problem. Insiders are your colleagues, they're the guy down the hall that you've known for years. It's very hard to convince yourself that that person is potentially a problem. And people are able to rationalize away some amazing things, as I'll get to in a moment in some of the cases. There's also often organizational reasons not to act. For example, if you file, a notice about somebody, it may be set up so that they have access to the information that it's you who's accusing them, and then there's potential for retaliation, or in any case, it's going to take up a huge amount of your time, and so there's there's all these things that organizations do that sometimes make it difficult. And to me, the most amazing part of this project was just the scale of the red flags that organizations are prepared to ignore in certain circumstances. So the first lesson, we have sort of 10 broad cross-cutting lessons. And the first is just don't assume you haven't got any insiders. An amazing number of organizations say, look, we are a high security organization. We've got loyal people. They've been working for us for years. I know them. We're not going to have an insider where we are. My colleagues in Russia are fond of this point of view. But it's not unique there. A lot of organizations have that view, and that can be a fatal mistake, as in the case of Indira Gandhi. So she ordered this crackdown on the Sikh mosque. There was huge Sikh anger. Her security manager beefed up her security force, but said to her, gee, you got to take the Sikhs off of your personal security detail for the time being. She said, no, I'm the prime minister for everybody. We're a multicultural democracy, and besides, some of the Sikhs, like Bain Singh, are they've been my trusted guards for years. I know them, I trust them. We're not going to have an insider problem in my organization. And Bain Singh and a cousin of his that he arranged to be on the same, shift, gunned her down. So don't assume you're not going to have any insiders. What did I do last time?
Marguerite, you have to approach the.
Well, now that the menu's up, I think you have to get out of the menu before it'll work again.
Okay.
Or do you click on next?
I'm obviously hitting the wrong button. There isn't
I
a
could
next
do it. I
button.
could do it through here.
Oh, okay. All right. So a special problem for that, don't assume you don't have any insiders, is this issue of that radicalization can happen very rapidly. So Bain Singh was a loyal employee up to a few weeks before the assassination. There was, at Doel 4, when they started doing the investigation, they found, this isn't the guy, because he'd left maybe 2 years before, but we had a guy who was cleared he passed through a security clearance process for access to the vital areas, and he went off to fight for terrorists in Syria. And according to his family, he was radicalized after the security clearance process took place in a period of only a few months. And you see more and more of these kinds of cases. This is an image of a similar, a not security-oriented case in Australia, where in just a few weeks, this person went from being more or less a normal teenager to being a serious insider problem. Maybe you can just tell me which button it is.
I am not sure.
Okay, all right.
But I could just click it for you.
Okay, all right. I'll just do next slide,
Just know that
please.
we have
All right,
to
okay. So, next slide, please. All right, so a second lesson is don't assume that because I got background checks, I won't have a problem. Background checks are a snapshot in time, so they don't deal with people changing, like the rapid radicalization issue, but also they're imperfect. They don't tell you everything about a person. Aldrich Ames, one of the most devastating spies in US history, passed his background checks with flying colors, passed lie detector tests. Leonid Smirnov was the person who perpetrated one of the first really well-documented thefts of highly enriched uranium back in 1992. He'd been a trusted employee for many years at the facility. The other thing is, even if your employees are loyal, even if I'm not going to convince you that you could have an insight that anybody could be disloyal, if somebody kidnaps their family and their children are at risk, they're going to do what the kidnappers want. So in the 2004 Northern Bank case, the bank had a totally sensible security system, required 2 senior officers of the bank to turn their keys to open the vault. A gang kidnapped the families of 2 senior officers of the bank and went off with millions of dollars. So don't assume that background checks alone solve the problem. Next slide, please. Another problem is people think, oh, well, there'll be some indicator. There'll be red flags and we'll act on the red flags and that will address the problem. But don't assume that the red flags are always going to be read properly. And again, this was to me, the most amazing thing is the scale of red flags that would go off. So, Nidal Hassan was, first of all, incredibly bad at his job. He had, performance ratings in the lowest available tier routinely. Just didn't show up to psychiatry sessions with patients, but also was routinely expressing radical beliefs, saying that, he thought his obligation to Sharia superseded his obligation to the United States and to the Constitution and to the Army. He expressed support for Osama bin Laden. He expressed support for suicide bombing. And he did this openly. This was not a rapid radicalization case. This was going on over years. And people did notice, and they did report to superiors, and nobody did anything about it. So there's a number of interesting aspects, and Amy Ziegert's chapter is fascinating. In a way, it's like Diane Vaughan's brilliant book on the Challenger launch disaster, because in that case, what the official government investigations concluded was, essentially bad managers overrode the rules because they were in a hurry to get the shuttle flying again. And she said, no, that is not what happened. What happened is people followed the procedures exactly, and it led to disaster. And that's what Amy found in this case as well. The Army had a system where you had two sets of evaluation reports. You had an evaluation report that went with you, the officer evaluation report, but that was only for the purposes of promotion. And in the Army at that time, for people of Hassan's rank, essentially everybody was intended to be promoted. And there wasn't even a place on the form to write down anything negative about anybody. It was like yes, no questions about various things. And then there was a separate form that was just for your commander to sort of oversee the management of the people who were in his command now, where the real information was written down. And there was all sorts of negative information about Hassan there, but then that would be tossed in the trash can when you got transferred to somebody else. And people were eager to transfer Nidal Hassan. So he was transferred from, and part of what you do, many of you may have done this, you may have given somebody a more positive recommendation than they deserved in order to encourage somebody else to hire them. So in the Army at the time, this was referred to as people being packaged for export. So he was repeatedly packaged for export. And actually, although to the credit of the person who had been his commander at Walter Reed, he did actually call up the commander at Fort Hood and warned him. He said, "You are getting our worst." And yet no action was taken. So then he started emailing with Anwar al-Awlaki, a known terrorist. And the first email that he sent that did trip the sort of intelligence system said, is it appropriate for someone in the US military under the laws of jihad to kill other people in the military if he thinks the military is doing things that are against Islam? And so then there was a joint terrorism task force that looked into it. There were actually two that got crosswise as to who was whose responsibility it was to keep an eye on this. And the one that sort of got the ball initially, the person assigned was a person who had been assigned to the task force from the Defense Department. And the Defense Department was sort of looking around saying, who can we spare? Because it's not our job to do this joint terrorism task force stuff. So they sent someone from the Criminal Investigative Service who had no counterterrorism background, no counterintelligence background, and when he investigated these emailing with Anwar al-Awlaki, he never interviewed Hassan, never interviewed any of his superiors, and never interviewed any of his colleagues. The investigation took 4 hours, and he concluded that this was praiseworthy research on the threat. Next slide, please. So another case of amazing red flags not read is Bruce Ivins, who almost certainly committed the anthrax attacks in 2001. The evidence is overwhelming, but he was never brought to trial because he committed suicide as he was about to be indicted. First therapist he ever had, he was deeply mentally disturbed. First therapist he ever had decades before thought he was the most dangerous client she'd ever had in her entire career. Although she had no idea he had gone on to work on biological weapons issues, when she saw the headline about the anthrax attacks, her first thought was, I wonder if that's Bruce. Took the FBI 5 years to figure out it was Bruce. I mean, there are just amazing numbers of red flags within the organization. By the way, all of that was in his medical records. He had signed multiple documents giving the organization access to his medical records. Nobody ever bothered to look. If they had bothered to look for 15 minutes, they would have taken away his access to pathogens immediately. But also, there were things going on in the organization that were just obvious red flags. He sent an email to his staff complaining about his own worsening paranoia and speculating about ending up in the newspaper with a headline of "Mad Scientist in Control of Deadly Anthrax." And that was not reported. One of his staff went to his boss and said, I'm frightened he's going to hurt me. And all that supervisor did was say, oh, well, there's this part of the lab that he doesn't have access to at the moment. Why don't you work there for the time being? There's no further investigation, no further reporting to anybody. So it was really quite stunning. And part of it was he had been strange for a long time. And he was strange in some positive ways as well. He would write poems for people when they left. He sang at children's birthday parties, and so people, used to this guy being strange, sort of immunized the organization to more severe versions of his strangeness. And believe me, there's more. It's, there was one particular woman that he'd been obsessed with for decades from graduate school who had, not returned his advances. And when the Society for Microbiology sent out a sort of all members email saying, look, probably one of us knows the guy who did this. Do any of you have any thoughts as to who it might be? They got a total of one response, and it was from her. She said, I knew this guy in graduate school, and he's been pestering me ever since. He could do something like this, and that was Bruce. When he became obsessed with her sorority, and when the investigators were quite gentle with him because they were warned that he was potentially suicidal. And so they said, well, we see that you have this interest in this sorority. This was after the attacks, when the FBI were interviewing him. And he said, not an interest, an obsession. Anyway, so another lesson is don't assume there's only one. A lot of security systems are designed around the idea of one insider acting alone, or potentially acting with outsiders. Because it's actually complicated and expensive to try to figure out, well, how do I have a security system that's going to work if there are 2 or 3 people working together? We're called the Northern Bank. Well, it takes 2 officers of the bank to turn their keys. They weren't thinking about, well, what if 2 are working together?
Or the nuclear launch keys.
Right.
Takes 2 also.
Right. But it turns out, if you look at non-nuclear thefts from well-guarded facilities, more than one insider, at least in one data set, was more common than an insider acting alone. So we do need to think hard about the multiple insider problem. So another thing that comes up a lot is organizations relying on some particular defense measure they have. I've got portal monitors, and they'll set off an alarm if anybody's taking out, material I'm worried about. Or exit searches, and that will alarm if somebody's taking out the material I'm worried about. Or I mentioned the background checks already. Or I've got a seal on this thing. But a lot of security measures, each individual one has vulnerabilities and can potentially be defeated. And so you really need a multi-layered approach to try to put as many obstacles in the insider's path that are as complex to get past as you can arrange. This is an amazing, if you ever want to read a true life sort of Ocean's 11 type story, the Antwerp Diamond Center heist in 2003, there's a great book about it called Flawless. They had layer after layer after layer of security for the Antwerp Diamond Center. About 80% of the world's cut diamonds go through there. And this gang established a real diamond buying and selling firm and rented an office in the building, rented a safe deposit box in the vault, and spent 2 years collecting intelligence, going in and out of the vault, you know, through the building, etc., and managed to defeat every aspect of the security system. Next slide, please. All right, another big one that sort of, in a way, colors all the rest is don't assume that the culture of the organization doesn't matter and that the morale of the employees or the lack of morale or even disgruntlement of the employees doesn't matter. This obviously is not an insider threat incident. This is an outsider incident with a nun and 82-year-old nun and 2 other elderly protesters intruding at Y12. And you know, they went through 3 alarmed layers of fencing, setting off alarms in a line going directly toward the HEU building, got right to the building, were painting on it, pounding on it with hammers, singing songs. The people, there were very heavily armed guards inside the building who heard the pounding and thought, gee, even though it's before dawn and we haven't been notified about any construction, we'll assume it's construction and we won't bother to check. So how could the guards not respond? Eventually one guard did respond. Turns out they had recently installed a new intrusion detection system, and they had tried to cut corners on the cost and sort of integrate it with some of the old intrusion detection system, and that screwed up and was setting off about 10 times as many false alarms as previously. Well, normally you would check out the false alarms with the cameras, so that wouldn't be a huge problem. Cameras had been broken for months in this area of the facility and nobody had bothered to fix them. So the compensatory measure for that is you send out the guards. But the guards, there were so many false alarms, they'd gotten sick of it and started assuming that alarms were false alarms. And at that point, you know, you may as well not even have an intrusion detection system because nobody's reacting to it. So there was clearly a major breakdown in security culture that actually affected the security performance of the organization. Next slide, please. So disgruntlement is a big issue for insider threats, a very big driver, and Chelsea Manning is an interesting case. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about Chelsea Manning, I'm going to talk a little about Edward Snowden. I'm not making any value judgment as to whether what they did was good, bad, or indifferent, but clearly from the point of view of the organizations within which they were insiders, what they did was a devastating action that the organization wants to prevent further actions of that kind. She also was an emotional disturbance case, pretty clearly. She was sort of dealing with her dawning transgender identity in the era of still don't ask, don't tell in the military. But she, like Nidal Hassan, was quite bad at her job and was constantly late. And she was told at a certain point, like, we're taking away your 1 day a week off because you're so late all the time. And she got so angry, she flipped over the interview table and went for the gun rack in the room and had to be restrained. And then 3 weeks later is when she started downloading. So it turns out, next slide please, that that's not unusual. So in one study of cyber sabotage cases, they found that 92% of the cases in their database happened after some negative work event. Somebody was denied a promotion, somebody was reprimanded, somebody didn't get the job that they were expecting to get, and somebody they thought was not as good as them got it, and then they would carry out these acts. And over half of the perpetrators were already perceived by other people in the organization as being disgruntled employees, but the organization hadn't taken any action about that. It also turns out that there are pretty simple steps organizations can take that really reduce disgruntlement a lot. If you have a reasonable system where people can make complaints and somebody actually listens and validates the complaint, says, gee, I'm sorry that's happening for you, that must be hard. And every once in a while actually acts on the complaint if there's a reasonable complaint that something needs to be done about. It's remarkable how much you can reduce employee disgruntlement for a modest amount of money and really reduce insider threats while simultaneously making people more happy than they were otherwise. Whereas a lot of the things you do to deal with the insider threat might make people, more sort of everybody not trusting everybody else. So, next slide, please. A seventh lesson is don't forget that the insiders may know about the security measures. There was a great article years ago by the guy who was the security chief for the Siberian chemical combine, and he described the guards as the most dangerous internal adversaries, partly because they knew the security system and had weapons available and things like that. But this is a case, one example is Robert Hansen, another one of the most devastating spies in US history, who handed to the Soviets, or later the Russians, quite a number of US agents who were captured and executed. He was a counterintelligence officer. He was one of the people in charge for looking for them all, who was him. And so he was able to monitor the investigation and act in ways that wouldn't be caught by the kinds of investigation that were being done. Next slide, please. Similarly, Edward Snowden was an NSA systems administrator. And part of his job was looking for the cyber weaknesses in the system. Now, we don't know whether the reason that he had himself transferred to Hawaii was that he knew that they hadn't yet installed there the network monitoring software that would notice if there was, massive downloading by some person on the network. But it is a fact that he had himself transferred to Hawaii and that they hadn't yet installed that software, and so he was able to use very simple tools to download a giant amount of material without being detected. Next slide, please. An eighth lesson is don't assume people are following the security rules. There's a bunch of stuff that's in the rule book, and it ain't what happens day to day. I love this particular photograph. This is a door at a Russian nuclear facility, and the fence provided with U.S. assistance that's propped open. And what's amazing about it is it's propped open on the day the American investigators were there to take a picture of it being propped open, which indicates that people there really didn't get the concept that it was a problem that it was propped open. But this is not unique to that place and time.
Do you know which site this is?
This is actually building 114 at Kurchata.
You want me to tweet that out, right?
It doesn't say that in the GAO report, but that's where it is. But these things happen routinely. Guards patrolling without ammunition in their guns, that's happened both in Russia and in the United States. Guards falling asleep, that's happened in both countries, other countries as well. Guards actually turning off the intrusion detectors because they get so ticked off by the false alarms. And people violate the security rules because they're inconvenient to follow. In most organizations, there are rules that the employees perceive as stupid and a waste of time, and employees violate those rules. And so I actually think one important aspect of security is pruning the stupid rules as much as possible, because as soon as you're in a world where the employees think a bunch of the rules are stupid, then they're going to suspect that the other rules are stupid, and the employees don't have the full threat picture that are why some of those rules were put in place in the first place. And if the employees are picking and choosing which rules to follow, you're going to be in a world of hurt. But you got to keep in mind that the real practice is going to be different than what's in the rule book. Next slide, please. This is just another, I hate to beat up so much on my friends at Y12, but this was a case involving, they did have realistic testing of the security system against outsider attack, and the tests were important to the people guarding the facility because it affected the bonus payment for the guard contractor. And so they found someone who would leak to them exactly when and where and using what tactics the attack would take place, and so that made it a lot easier to defend. And there's also reports, which as far as I know have never been fully confirmed, that they were tampering with they use sort of laser tag type equipment for these kinds of tests, and allegedly they were essentially putting the batteries in upside down so that the defenders were invincible. They couldn't be killed. Next slide, please. A ninth lesson is don't assume that only the consciously malicious actions matter. The inadvertent insider can be quite important as well. So this is the jailbreak in New York a couple of years ago. A jail that I believe had never previously had an escape in its history. And there was a conscious insider who had an odd nascent sexual relationship with one of the inmates. But there was also an inadvertent insider who knew the inmates, was trading things with them for information about other inmates to try to increase his situational awareness of what was going on in the prison, had given them things he thought were innocuous, a screwdriver, pliers, things like that, and access to this catwalk, and a bunch of hamburger from the conscious insider, and it was a lot of hamburger. So inside it were hacksaws. Next slide, please. So in cyber in particular, the inadvertent insider is a big deal. We've all received the phishing emails, etc., and they're getting more and more targeted and sophisticated. And actually, in the world of social media, it makes it much easier for adversaries to learn enough about you to make them targeted and sophisticated. In my own case, we were having a meeting at one point about Chinese nuclear forces. That might have been while Jeffrey was there, I'm not sure, I can't remember. And we had somebody from what was then still called the 2nd Artillery coming, and Bonnie Glazer from the Center for Strategic and International Studies was coming. And so I'd get an email from Bonnie saying, here's my talk from the meeting about threat reduction. So it's a known person coming to a real meeting, my subject, etc. So I click on the attachment, and turned out she'd never sent such an email. And a bunch of other people in her address book had gotten emails targeted to them. And eventually the FBI got involved and did ultimately trace it to a PLA IP address in Shanghai or something like that. So the inadvertent insider is very important in the cyber world, John Podesta being an obvious recent example. And of course the intentional insider is also even more devastating in the cyber world. Next slide, please. Finally, the last lesson is don't assume you're going to prevent everything. Think also about mitigation for the things you don't manage to prevent. This obviously is not a security incident. This is a safety incident, the destroyed reactor at Fukushima. But even if they hadn't done enough prevention to, for example, not have the diesel generators in the basement or to have a higher seawall, if they had had an emergency ability to restore the electricity quickly or get water into the core, you wouldn't have had as devastating. So you've got to think about mitigation as part of your insider program. I mean, think again about Chelsea Manning. She was a private. Why did a private have access to secret cables from every diplomatic post on the planet? This makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, when that happened, I was like, I'm a taxpayer paying $30 billion plus a year for the intelligence operations of the U.S. government, and that's how they're handling it? I was ticked. Next slide, please. This refers to the Hegghammer and Daly chapter, which I definitely recommend to your attention. So it's sort of a caveat in that their argument is, that jihadis really don't think about this stuff very much. First of all, they only mention nuclear very, very rarely. And secondly, as far as we can tell, they have never, ever mentioned anywhere the possibility of recruiting a person who's an insider at a nuclear facility. Next slide, please.
How does this,
Can I?
oh,
Go
okay.
ahead.
So is this, how does this square with what you know about the case in Belgium?
So the case in Belgium was a self-radicalized person. There's no indication that there was outreach on the part of ISIS to try to recruit that person because he was at a nuclear facility. And actually, I'll mention him in a moment here. So,
Also, they did the surveillance.
Surveillance, yeah.
oh, in that case, so that recent case, we don't, in my view, know enough about that. It is discussed in the Hank Cameron Daily chapter, but only briefly. We don't really know what they were trying to do. It is a plausible theory that the reason they were monitoring the home of that senior official of the Belgian research facility was to, do some kind of a coercion operation, kidnap his children or something like that, and force them to do something related to the nuclear facility. But we don't know that to be true for sure, and we don't know what specifically it was that they wanted. I mean, that facility does have a bunch of highly enriched uranium, and it's an obvious potential speculation that that was the target, but that's speculation. But I want to offer a little bit of a caveat to the caveat, which they also do in their chapter. Number one, again, almost all the known cases of real theft, real sabotage, have been done by insiders or with the help of insiders. Number two, jihadis routinely use insiders in other contexts. So this is not an unfamiliar tactic to them. In the Chechen War, it was not at all unusual for them to kidnap families of military officers on the Russian side to try to get them to do this, that, or the other. In the recent case of an assault in Afghanistan, killed over 100 Afghan troops, there were reported to be 4 insiders at the base working with the outside attackers. In this case of Ilyas Bugalov, or the case of Sharif Mobley in the United States, who was employed at 5, I think, U.S. nuclear power plants, and was an Al-Qaeda person, is an indication that you can have sort of self-radicalized people who then reach out, which, from our point of view, is just as bad as if the terrorists are reaching in a certain sense, or infiltrating people. Now, it's interesting, Bugalov left for Syria at a time when the Islamic State was still saying, come to our caliphate to fight for the caliphate. But then they changed their tune and said, no, stay where you are and carry out attacks where you are. So it's an interesting question, what would have happened if he had still been at the reactor when that other message was being sent. Next slide, please. So,
Organizations do.
what?
Building a high performance
What?
and high vigilance.
Oh dear.
That's the sound somehow.
Yeah, no, I had a recorded version of this. I must have copied the slide. So, can we turn off the audio?
Okay, anybody could help me? Please.
Sorry. Wow, 2 versions of one. Contemplation.
Somebody was on the phone.
But it was reading the actual text.
Right, it was
Yeah.
All right, so I have to modify the, no, back, 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 back,
The unwitting insider.
Go one more.
back. Yeah, that's the one.
So you
That's
want
the
to
problem.
Just put the,
Just
kill the,
Can you just kill the sound?
Vigilance, collaboration.
Yeah, should we just...
Everyone.
Or you can sit down with
Suggesting
your-
is not-
Yeah, I mean, you could just listen to the recorded version.
on the top level on the right hand side, just kill the sound.
Okay. All right.
Like a-
Okay.
Thank you.
So, the book doesn't have as much as perhaps it should on, what are the good practices, and that's definitely something we're thinking about in follow-on projects. But it's clear that, an organization can't just build a strong security culture. It needs to actually be able to do its job, carry out its mission. So you need somehow to build a high performance culture that is also a high vigilance culture. And I think those are not as much in contradiction as people might think. In the nuclear industry on safety, they have definitely found that high economic performance and high safety can go together because strong leadership helps with both. And I think the same is true with respect to a good approach to security. You need, as I mentioned, a comprehensive, multi-layered approach that puts as many complex obstacles in the path of the insider as possible. You need to have, there's assumptions build up throughout all this. You know, it's sort of, oh, it looks good to me, it should be fine, etc. So you need to have regular, realistic testing, red teaming, vulnerability assessment by sort of creative teams with a hacker mentality and incentive to find the weaknesses. Roger Johnston is a famed vulnerability assessor and has a hilarious but educational set of things that he calls security maxims. And one of his security maxims is the thanks for nothing maxim, which is any vulnerability assessment which finds no vulnerabilities or very few is incompetent and wrong. There are always vulnerabilities. Another one is the infinity maxim, which is there are an infinite number of vulnerabilities in any real security system, most of which will never be found either by the adversaries or by the defendant. So you need this regular assessment, and you need to, you know, different organizations are operating in different contexts, whether it's different national cultures that have to be addressed, or different cultures of organizations. I mean, I mentioned there's a chapter on casinos. You know, in casinos, you've got, the whole point is to get thousands of people to come in the door every day and then to go back out again every day. So you can't be, you know, searching everybody carefully as they're coming in and out and all of that kind of thing. So it's a very, and also just the casino industry being the way it is, they assume all of their employees are thieves. And they just build the system with that assumption in mind. And you know, if you're trying to build sort of a high loyalty organization like a nuclear organization, that's a problematic aspect. Next slide, please. So although background checks are imperfect, you got to have them. But you need ongoing monitoring of behavior, and not just, you know, every 5 years like my clearance is reviewed, but you know, you got to sort of be monitoring the behavior of employees regularly. You need to have requirements to report concerning behavior, and then incentives where you actually praise people, you know, award prizes, whatever, if somebody does something worthwhile, and so on. You need effective training, and there's a lot of training that is crap, where you have long lists of rules. Here's how you fill out the form, you know, etc. Nobody remembers it a week after they've done the training, or a month after they've done the training. If you have real stories of real things that happened and how the security system relates to preventing that terrible thing from happening again, people remember stories. You got to minimize the human access to the vital areas or materials or information or whatever, have continuous monitoring of all that, and then finally an effective investigation approach. The employees need to feel that whatever investigations you do are fair and reasonable. Because if somebody's going to get their head chopped off the moment anybody reports anything slightly, you know, concerning about them, nobody will report. And so you need to make it an environment where, you know, sort of looking into an issue is a sort of routine thing that happens regularly, and where part of the result might be that an employee that needs help gets the help that they need. I mean, if Bruce Ivins had gotten the help he needed, he'd still be alive, and a bunch of other people would still be alive as well. So I will stop there, and thank you for listening. I apologize for going on too long. I'm always interested in what have we missed? Are there other lessons? Have you got stories of insider episodes that were poorly handled by organizations, or organizations that are doing a great job in one way or another?